Today is day 4,948 that Boswell's been in business. Thank you. Thanks. And we're here, our conversationalist who's hiding behind me unintentionally, Coe Douglas, Milwaukee artist, writer, screenwriter, educator, intellectual, and all-around nice fella. He's going to do some conversationalizing with our guest, Joe Meno. Joe's author of books such as Marvel and Wonder, The Boy Detective Fails, and Hairstyles of the Damned. He's been awarded the Nelson Algren Literary Award, a Pushcart Prize, and was finalist for the Story Prize. He's professor in the English and Creative Writing Department at Columbia College Chicago, and he's here tonight with his book, The Book of Extraordinary Tragedies. It's earned lots of praise, lots of wonderful reviews, but I like this early praise that came in from another great Chicago author, Luis Alberto Urrea, who says of the new book, "I don't know how Joe Meno does it. If I did, I'd copy him." The book has such velocity, it generates wind, yet it is meditative and steeped in love, music, and human connection. It is stunning. You can't do much better than that. Please give Joe and Co a warm welcome.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks so much, Chris. Appreciate it.
I actually saw Luis read here a couple years, like probably 6 years ago, no, 5 years ago now, but awesome guy. Hey, thanks for coming out.
Oh, Coe, thank you so much for hosting this conversation. Thank you. I know there's like 8-10 different NBA games happening tonight. In the back of my mind, I have the Bulls game on somehow, like Zach LaVine not playing tonight,
Yeah.
Coe.
That's bad.
No, it's a bad start.
Yeah.
It's a bad start of the season. We had such high hopes last year, and I saw the Bulls. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see what happens with Zach LaVine and Lonzo. But thank you. In spite, or maybe like me, you're also interested in literature, music, and the NBA. And thank you for taking the time out for coming out this evening. I really appreciate it. I realized as I was driving up from Chicago, this is the 20th year that I've been coming to Boswell. Before this, it was a different bookstore, and since then, and to recognize what an amazing space this is for bringing people together to have conversations like this. So on kind of my behalf, will you thank Chris and Daniel for hosting this event by a big round of applause?
Yeah. Support Boswell, support local bookstores. I love this place. I've been coming here for a long time myself. So yeah. So where should we start? There's a lot to talk about with this book. There's a lot that happens that's really wonderful. So I guess for starters, I just want to tell you, I had this interesting experience of reading this novel that was as much a seeding of a soundtrack. So as I was going through, I had this idea that I would, because I was kind of flipping through when I first picked it up, and I started listening with headphones. And so every time Alex would mention a composer, I would listen to this song until the next song popped up, which was hard to keep up with at times.
Like 5 on a page.
I have an 8-hour Spotify playlist already of the tracks, but it was a lot of fun because it really adds music and tone and sound to this novel in a way that I've never experienced before. And I was wondering, how did that figure into the process of writing this book for you?
Thanks, Coe. I mean, that's such a lovely description. It's definitely part of what I was interested in putting the book together. So for a long time, I was a music journalist for publications like Punk Planet and Time Out Chicago. So I've always been interested in music. I think even in some ways before I was interested in writing, or that maybe at the same time, just when you're 12 or 13 and growing up in the 80s, there were things like just popular radio and MTV and seeing how that changed the way you looked at the world. I had this grandfather who was Yugoslavian, and he worked at the U.S. Steel plant in on the south side of Chicago. And he passed away when I was about 3 or 4 years old, and he had colon cancer. And at the time they had colon cancer, he was also smoking a lot. And he would sit in the back room of his house listening to classical music. And I remember being like 3 or 4 years old, and like being told, like, you have to go say hi to your grandfather. And you like step into this back room, and there'd be this veil of like cigarette smoke, and also this really strange, off-putting, like European classical music, and just being terrified. And he was also very taciturn and kind of stoic, and like just stepping close enough to say hello and like nod for it to qualify as like saying hello. And that was my only experience really with this like European classical music. And then just about 7, 8 years ago, I was helping my mom clean our garage, and I found this cardboard box full of these classical records that belonged to my grandfather. And it was this one moment where, I don't know, where you just kind of stumble upon a memory. And as soon as I opened that box, I could smell like that cigarette smoke and see him sitting there. And then I had this memory of the sound. And if you grow up like listening to, 70s music or 80s music or 90s or whatever, like we have this pattern in like popular music. There's like a verse, chorus, first chorus, and it's pretty familiar. And you have like two songs, you have a happy song and a sad song. And what's so strange about like classical music is that it draws from all these different traditions, and it's emotionally complex, and it could start happy and get sad and get happy again and end sadly. And it took me months of sitting and listening to my grandfather's record collection, try to understand like, what did this guy who was like this working class Yugoslavian guy, like, what did he hear? Why was he invested? Or like, why was he so interested in these records? And what was interesting about it to me? And so really, once I started kind of digging through those records and thinking about my relationship to music and trying to understand like how musicians or writers, you're really just trying to capture, make sense, give a shape to these human experiences. It's really the same kind of pursuit. That's when I started to think about, okay, well, what's the fiction here? What's the possibility of maybe building this into a book? And so it wasn't until after I had started developing this character named Alex, who's this 20-year-old kid who lives on the south side of Chicago with his family, and his relationship as a former classical prodigy, that I started to realize like, well, what if I actually built this book as like a symphony where it's in 4 parts like a symphony is, and there's kind of rise and fall to each of that. But it really all came back to that record collection and this faint memory of this guy I didn't know that well sitting in this back room who was like shielded or surrounded by this strange music.
Yeah, it comes really strongly through in the kind of the storylines. And then even with you mentioned the movements, I noticed, I actually looked up all the Italian meanings, and like you've got the one, the melancholy one in the second movement, which I actually found a musicologist talking about that was tied to Beethoven's commentary on his pending deafness, right?
Right.
So that's like all embedded, and you really feel that with the ebb and flow of how this story unfolds. And then beyond that, if you get to these, like, a symphony has these overarching themes, but then you have all these sub themes, these really wonderful things with the family members.
Right.
Talk about how that sort of emerged, because those are also just so wonderfully interesting, like with Daniel's stuff. And
so there's really 3 main characters in the book. There's Alex, who's 20, and when he's 10 years old, him and his older sister, they play classical music together. Their parents want them to become these like well-known classical musicians. He plays piano. His older sister, who's 2 years older, her name's Isabel, she plays cello, and he starts to lose his hearing around the age of 10. And I started losing my hearing in my 30s. My mother's deaf and my father's pretty far along with hearing loss. And for a long time, I just didn't talk about it. My wife, as hard as she could, tried to encourage me, like, you need to go get tested, and really just put it off for as long as I could, until I finally went in and recognized that I had severe hearing loss. And I had never written about it. And I think part of it was I didn't want to think of myself in that way. And whether you think of it as internalized ableism or, well, I just didn't want to think of myself as not being able to do the things I did, especially someone who loves music as much as I do. And I realized after I'd been given this diagnosis that I was missing notes. Like, I would hear music differently and put on the Beatles' White Album, and there were songs that just sounded different, and that would go, even the tone or pitch from major to minor would sound different for me. And so I finally started writing about it. And it was actually through writing about this character, Alex, who's dealing at the age of 20 with his own hearing loss, that I was able to finally start documenting like what it's like to live. And part of it was because there's just not a lot of novels or films or TV shows that really describe like this is what it's like to live with this thing, you know. And it was important to me to try and just capture some of the challenges, but also just the way I hear sounds can be incredibly beautiful because of the loss, which is something that I never thought of. Like I have tinnitus, which means I just have this ringing in my ears all the time. And the pitch changes over the course of the day. And so this weird thing happens around 9:30 or 10 at night where the pitch has gotten to this one kind of spot. And it almost sounds like crickets when they vibrate and hum at this. And it actually has become this strangely comforting thing that I just never would have, imagined. So I want to try to build some of those things in the book. So there's Alex, who's 20 and has this hearing loss, and he's in love with music, but he can't really participate anymore, even though he thinks about it all the time. And then he has his older sister, Isabel, who's 2 years older. She's also someone who loves music. She went to MIT to study math and bombed out after like a semester because it turned out all she was really good at was memorizing things, even though she didn't understand any of the stuff she was memorizing. And then she gives birth to a daughter right after she fails out of MIT. So it's Alex and Isabel, and then her daughter, whose name is Jazzy. And Alex and his niece developed this really strong relationship. She's 3.5, 4 years old.
She has hearing loss as well.
She, as the book goes on, they soon figure out that she's also dealing with her own hearing loss. And, there's a lot of speculation, some research about the multiple causes of hearing loss. And it's crazy that there's not one answer, or you can't just go take a test and say, oh, this is what caused it, right? So it can be anything from a virus, right, like, which is strange and kind of terrifying to think about, to a genetic predisposition, to your surroundings or environment. And then there's also some theories that like it's epigenetic, which means it's passed on, and then you could trigger that through some environment. So in the case of my family, it definitely seems genetic, but I was also a musician and music journalist for a long time, and I know that definitely didn't help. So there's these three characters that make up the core of the book. There's also Alex's mom, who's this kind of former librarian who's dealing with depression, and like the thing she loves most about the world is thinking about how terrible things could be. And she likes to play this game where she imagines different celebrities are Polish, like secretly Polish. And
it's so great.
Roberts
is one. Yeah.
Julia Roberts, no, well, like Tom Cruise, just because of how tragic his life is. She's like, well, he has to be Polish.
And then she's working on a theatrical
Play.
piece. Yeah.
She's working on this play that depicts like the ups and downs of Tom Cruise's life. But in her play, for some reason, Tom Cruise's parents are played by like George Clooney and Julia Roberts.
Yeah.
Even though they're like all the same age.
Yeah, it's awesome.
And they try to explain the mom, and she's just like, no, that's how it is. And then there's a little brother named Daniel, and he's 13. Yeah. And he's also really interested in this like family tradition, relationship to tragedy. He does this thing where he takes like his favorite comics and he like traces them, but they're like these really sad moments, like Spider-Man like filling out his taxes, or like the Invisible Woman gets cancer because they can't detect it because she's invisible, and just all these like horrible. And though Alex is like, I'm really worried about you. You seem like a cry for help.
There's also the luggage phase.
And then, he starts going to the airport, Midway Airport, which is the airport where I grew up on the South Side. And he just goes there and starts like stealing luggage to take home. And he like just tries the different clothes on.
Yeah, he's wearing a scuba costume in one scene.
That's right.
And then Benny brings home all the costumes and he goes for the ghost costume phase, which is really great.
So there's a cousin, Benny, who's from Poland, who's come to the United States about 10 years before. And he's always involved in these like various slightly illegal activities, like going into like a burned out sporting goods store and, like looting it, or it's always like some weird bartering system. Like he gets all these like artificial legs and trades them for something else. And they use the house as like a staging area. So like anytime Alex opens the garage to get his bike to go to work, there could be like a whole bunch of arms and legs, or like Halloween costumes, or some balloons that all say like condolences.
There's briefly a bomb.
There's like a World War II training bomb, that they used, that the Navy used for training purposes during World War II, and it's just like sitting in their front room.
Yeah, but then the way Daniel kind of contends with some of this stuff, I love this. The other thing I love in the novel is the book he's writing. Right. I'd love to talk about that.
So Daniel, as like this 13-year-old kid, he just, I think like many of us, especially over the last couple of years, is struggling with this question of like, how do you keep going on in this world where bad things keep happening? And even with the support from his family, he can't quite figure it out. So he takes like one of his composition notebooks and he writes down, his plan is to write down everything bad that's happened in the 20th century. Like every horrible historical event, World War II, Chernobyl, like everything. And his idea is like, if he can do that, he can figure out what the pattern is. Because if you can figure out the pattern for why bad things happen, then you can stop it or try and avoid it. And at some point, he recognizes, well, there's just not a pattern. So he starts changing these things, and like, Jesus dying on the cross gets turned into like Jesus almost dying, and they sneak him away at the end. And
Grows old somewhere, right?
yeah, and so like these horrible things that happen, he's forced to basically turn them into fiction to avoid the realization that you can't stop these catastrophes. And growing up in this like Eastern European family, I recall really clearly, like on Sunday afternoons, going to the Polish side of my family and just sitting in these like front rooms on the like sofa with the plastic covering and this classical music playing, and these very quiet, stoic aunts and uncles, like every so often would tell a story, but it always ended in this most tragic way. Like, and then the Soviets dragged the horses out and shot them all. And you just be like, okay. And then, but then it would be almost like a competition. Like, and then someone else would be like, oh, and it became this like, almost like a game, like a chess game. And I realized like, that's how, because of, historical dislocation, in Poland and Croatia, where my family's from, Poland had switched hands so many times from Russia to Austria to the Germans, right? Literally, my grandfather who came over from Poland, his paper said Russia, because at the time it was part of Russia, even though, later became returned to Poland. And same with the Croatian side of my family. They, parts of Croatia and Bosnia had been under the Turk rule for 400 years, then the Austrians, then Germans. And so that feeling of not trusting happiness, of when happiness or joy shows up, you almost have to dispel it, because at some point, historically something's going to happen. That felt so strange to me as a kid. And it was only later that I realized like what a gift that was, to not expect or feel like you deserve happiness all the time. And that's definitely something that the members of this family are eventually trying to reconcile themselves to.
Yeah, you can really feel how it ebbs and flow with Alex, because he just has these people come in and out of his life, and he has like Alex at the end and the young woman at the laundromat, and he just has this real sense of doubting, I guess, his potential, right? Even though he has, I think, a lot of potential that's sort of implied. How did that sort of unfold as far as the trajectory of these stories? I mean, the way it ends, I don't want to give away endings, but I mean, how did that sort of unfold into where it heads for you, and like from where it began?
So I'm really fascinated with well, how people respond to these different catastrophes or tragedies. You see these group of painters after World War II, or these group of writers, and there seems to be this tacit understanding that, like, well, we can't necessarily stop these things from happening, but what you can do is take these pieces and try and build something out of them. And that's kind of what I think about my own life and my own experiences, the things that I regret or the different challenges that I face. Like, all I can really do, I can't go back and change them, can't stop these difficult things from happening, but I can try and reframe them, make a story or a book out of them. And so for Alex, dealing with his family, and the different challenges that they have, he finds out his older sister has cancer, and his niece is dealing with hearing loss in the same way that he has. His mother's dealing with these different issues. He can't stop these things, and a lot of these things are definitely drawn from my own family, their own challenges. But what he starts thinking about is, well, how can I take these things and build something out of them? He gets this letter from his grandfather, who escaped communist Yugoslavia. And it's a letter from his great-great-grandfather, who he never met, that's written all in musical notation as a way to avoid the censors, the bureaucrats back in Yugoslavia. And so it's really the family story written in this kind of fragments of music. And so he starts understanding, like, well, all I can really do is add to this thing. And, like, what can I bring that'll add to it? And the other thing that he does, and this again kind of comes from my own experience with hearing loss, is when I first started losing my hearing, I did this kind of ridiculous thing, or I'd been losing it for a while, since my early 30s, but I wasn't diagnosed till my 40s. And I did this thing where, like, finally my wife wore me out, and it's like, you got to go get the test. And I did an online hearing test, which said I got like 100 out of 100. I was like, great, no problem. So I went into Northwestern, and, like, they put you, I don't know if you've ever had this. They put you in this little audiology lab, soundproof room. It's like a little recording studio almost, and it's dark. And they give you the headphones and a microphone to speak into. And before the test started, like, and you have the buttons, you've been there, you got buttons on either hand, right? And I had this, like, ridiculous number based on no facts or evidence. Like, I was just like 17. Like, how bad could this be? Like, they'll say, you've lost 17% of your hearing. Like, that was the number I just decided. Like, I was ready. And so they do the tones in your different ears, and then they do the words. And I was on the word part, and the words would start off like at a normal pitch or volume, and they would get fainter. And I was realizing, like, too much time was going by without me hearing anything. And I'm, like, hitting the button because I was, like, trying to guess, like, certainly they were playing a sound there. And then I was like, I'm not supposed to be doing this. Yeah. And then that's all I was doing. It was just trying, I was like, it's gotta be it. Like, and the audiologist came out with, like, an iPad, and there was a graph, and they can show you exactly where you've lost your hearing in the overall kind of pitch sequence. And it was like I imagine it's like the Grand Canyon right in the middle. And the audiologist, I think, assumed, like, I already knew how bad it was. And she's like, well, you've lost 46% of your hearing. And I was like, 17, supposed to be 17. Yeah. 46. Like, I was not prepared. I felt, it was one of those few times in my life I literally felt like the blood leave my face. I don't know where it went, but I just was like, where you get so stunned. I also felt embarrassed, and just kind of I felt culpable. Like, I was like, oh, I was always at the front of these shows. Never would it occurred to me to wear earplugs, and it was just a really powerful moment. I was kind of out of my own body for a couple minutes afterwards. And after that, I decided like, well, I can, you know what I'm going to do? I will listen to all my favorite records before it gets worse. Right. Like I felt this clock was starting to tick down. So I did this thing where I listed out all my favorite records and I was going to sit and listen to Kanye West's Graduation or the White Album or Love Supreme or whatever, right? And I would just listen to them all because I was convinced that at some point I just would no longer be able to hear them in their fullness. And then I got through the first 2 or 3 records and it got so frustrating because I knew they were records I had heard so many times and I knew I was missing things or things sounded different. And I was like, this is no way to experience, right? Like something beautiful. I was trying to hold on to something. And after that, I decided to do this thing where it's like, instead of focusing on what I can't hear and what's not there, what if I start trying to focus on what I'm hearing differently? Like standing in a corner and just the way silence sounds different to me now because of tinnitus or because of the loss. Or like, and this is going to sound strange, but like my kids, like they go to bed and I'll like just kind of tilt my head into their room at night and just hear that silence. Or like during the pandemic, we planted this garden and there was like 5 or 6 different like species of bees. And I would just go out there with these bees and try to distinguish like this bee. And they just sound, and so instead of focusing on what I didn't hear, I was focusing on silence as its own kind of shape. And that was something that Alex in this book, he eventually, as he's starting to accept his hearing loss, accept what's happening with his niece and her loss, he starts kind of going out looking for these opportunities, almost like collecting these different kinds of silences around the city of Chicago.
Yeah, I think he literally says that at one point in the book. And there's so much. I have in my notes all these lines about quiet and silence and just this pursuit of silence. And I'm wondering, can we talk about John Cage a little bit?
Oh,
Because you can't have a discussion about music and sound without John Cage, right?
Yeah,
Because
20th century changed by this guy. Yeah.
I mean, because first of all, there's the pursuit of the vinyl album by Alex that for his father, which is one thing. But then also, I just wanted to think about 433 because there's a lot of scenes where Alex is doing this thing where he's pausing with his hands over a keyboard, kind of in this moment of anticipation. And I got to think that's something that was intentional, right?
Yes. So I don't know. Is anyone here else? Everyone's a fan of John Cage. Yeah, this is the most amazing audience ever. So yeah, like, you know, that one composition, if you listen to some of his earlier pieces, they're a lot more improvised. And if all you know John Cage for is that one piece, that's amazing. But it was kind of everything up into his career was leading up to that. It was early, I think it was 1939, 1940, before the US officially joined World War II, and it was kind of a protest song. And the idea of silence being just as, if not more powerful than any of these different notes you can assemble, and the political and kind of social ramifications of that. It's still to this day, it's just amazing. And he has this composition that I love. It's called Quartets 1 through 8. And what he did is he took these like songs from the 15th, 16th century, like religious Christian songs, and he chopped them up. And he took this melody and gave it to this instrument, and then he took this melody from another song and gave it to this other instrument. And it's so powerful and miraculous. It's really moving. It sounds like a song of 100 different beginnings. It's almost like a composition where it just keeps starting. It's really hopeful and powerful. But in some ways it's like before hip hop, before, you know, the way we understand music now is this constructed thing you do on a computer where you take these different pieces and build something new out of it. And again, and that was one of the things that you can't stop these things from happening. What can you do? You can take these pieces and try and build something from them. And so that was such an amazing inspiration for the book. And it's one of the things, Alex, his dad, is this kind of absent guy. He's a former musician. He was the one who really wanted his kids to be these, classical musicians. And for most of the book, he's largely kind of floating in the background. And he's the one who introduced Alex to this John Cage composition. And Alex goes to these different record stores around Chicago looking for this on vinyl, and he can never find it. And when he finally does, he goes to bring it to his father, but they're so like estranged and distant that all he can really do is he like sneaks into his apartment and just like leaves it for him.
Yeah, it's a great scene.
And I thank you but I think about that as like music as the thing that best captures these complicated emotions that I couldn't even as a writer begin to put into words. Yeah. And you think of the relationship you have with your dad, or maybe a complicated relationship you have with your family or someone you love, and how even the best novel in the world, yeah, because it's finite and because it's rational and reasonable, it fails to capture that complexity, I think, in a way. And so that song or that composition becomes kind of a stand-in for him and his father.
Yeah. And this thing about silence too, like we live in such a noisy world, and like I've done this with students where we do slow listening exercises. And when you are silent and just kind of listen, so much creeps in, right? There's so much in the background in the sort of composition that's part of the rhythms of how we live, and I think that also comes through a lot in this novel, because we don't think when we go through like learning fiction, studying fiction, we talk about plot and character, but we don't really talk about sound like we should. And your novel particularly, I was so keenly aware of all the descriptions of sounds, like the Mylar balloons, and there's all these things that just kind of amplified off the page.
Oh, thanks, Coe. Well, I think about like, I maybe start fiction from a different place. Like I think about character, like who are the characters? And I knew it was Alex and his sister and his niece. But then I'm also thinking about like, what's the feeling or the atmosphere or the tone that you want this book to have. And I wanted to feel complicated. The book's set in like 2008. So it really leads up to the 2009 Great Recession. And in the neighborhood, and I'm sure there's places throughout Milwaukee, in the neighborhood I grew up in Chicago, 30% of those homes on the south side of the neighborhood where I grew up went underwater. Families had to leave, and that part of Chicago still hasn't recovered. It's largely responsible. There's been this kind of mass exodus of African-American families from Chicago. And it's this wound in a lot of ways that we're still trying to make sense of. And it's a literal absence, like a literal silence. You drive through this neighborhood and there's these homes that are still either up for sale or vacant. And you feel that, or you drive, and this is before the pandemic, you drive through that part of the city and it does feel silent in such a different way. And I just think like, well, what can I do with a book that you can do differently than a movie or television show or a video game? And there's something about being given this opportunity to be alone, to be quiet, to focus on sound or language in a way when you're watching a great film or book, or a film or TV show, you maybe aren't asked to engage in those senses, to just stop and slow down and pause in a piece of fiction. And that's not to say, there's a lot of things that happen. This kid, Alex, is like always on his bike, zipping from one, challenge to another. But that, I think the older I get, the more I really appreciate, like I drove up here from Chicago, it was 80 minutes. Yeah. And it's like such a gift to have 80 minutes alone in a car. I had like 3 different records picked out before I left. I was like, I'm going to listen to this, you know what I mean? Yeah. To have that space to just listen, I think maybe is one of the things that from the last 2.5 years of the pandemic, to like, what does it mean to be constantly bombarded by noise? And how does it affect us? How does it affect our anxieties and worries not to have these imaginary spaces where you can just be quiet.
Yeah, I really feel that. Also, there's a version of this talk where we would do a commercial break and
Yeah.
we would I don't want to say it on because we're recording, but the epic takedown of the fast food Italian restaurant is, with a design background, is absolutely brilliant. I'll just leave it at that for this, but
That's right. This book tour is being sponsored by that restaurant.
yeah, exactly.
There's a popular like Italian chain restaurant. Maybe you've been there. It's in every city.
Yes, but
And the family, like, well, one, just because of their resources, they're working class family, right? And that's just something we just don't see a lot of those characters in fiction and television shows and movies. And so, like, when the older sister Isabel, like, she gets a promotion at work, she works at a bank as like a teller or manager, and when she gets a promotion, like that's their version of going to like a fancy dinner. You go to this place, OG, and Alex is like, this is like, recognizes like how kind of fake and false the thing is, but it's also kind of a container for their happiness, because this is all they can afford. So like, we're going to eat every breadstick in this place. Like,
yep.
we're going to like enjoy this to the fullest as we can, even though you recognize that this is like a stand-in for, something else, is like a facsimile of a better version. And that's oftentimes, like, growing up in a working class family, like, that's what you get handed, oftentimes, is this like, here's what we think you should like, or here's what you can afford. So be grateful for that.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, another thing I love about the book is there is tragedy, there is heaviness, but there are a lot of these moments like that are just epically funny, like laugh out loud funny. And so playing with the movements of that takes you on quite a journey. So I appreciate that. But also I'm curious because, there is this sense of destiny, and is our fate determined, right? We have this family history, and how that's imparted on Jasmine, because you see some of these things start to manifest, and then you can also see resistance, right? Or maybe an opportunity to change the course of history. I'm just curious about like how that maybe played out in the evolution of this story.
So that thing, and I'm sure each of us in our own families, like, you grow up hearing these stories about your family and the kind of triumphs, but more often in my family, you'd hear like, and that's when this person married this person they shouldn't have, or like the stories that oftentimes got repeated, especially on the Eastern European side of my family, were like, and that's when everything went wrong. And I would be like, what is this? Yeah. But those are where you'd want to hear those stories, and you'd realize like, oh, there's a cycle, or there's this repetition, so a great grandfather, who married someone he shouldn't have, or someone who, worked in this thing and they were injured because of it, or whatever, there would be this reoccurring, almost musical reoccurrence of these different challenges or tragedies. It could be health, and in my family, there's hearing loss, or it could be personality. Like in the book, Isabel's a perfectionist, and it's one of the reasons she has, these different challenges in her life. And Alex can notice the same thing in his niece. She they have a school play, and they're doing like a play about Joan of Arc, and she like just refuses to participate. She just like lays down on the ground during like their, rehearsal. She just won't participate because she's afraid. She's afraid of like getting it wrong and it not being perfect. And like, the teacher is kind enough to give her a part as like a slain French soldier or whatever.
Right,
and so they're like, we can use this,
right.
and like that. Oh my gosh, Coe, like, I know I'm old enough now to see my mother and father and their lives connect to my own, and how so many of the traits, good and bad, are things that I've borrowed from them. And I can see it in my kids. My daughter's 14 and my son's 12, where you see them almost like reenacting, and you're like, I hope you figure And they are in an interesting way, like, oh, you figured this thing out at 12, and it took me till I was 24 to figure that out. But it's these like reoccurring things as you almost have to escape these different either genetic or personality traits that keep getting passed along. And if in some ways the things that make the people I love exceptional are also the things that kind of damn them at the same time, so like being a perfectionist is great. My daughter's, like her teachers love her, but we're also like, hey, you probably don't need to redo that art project a third time. Like it's 11:30, we all want to go to bed, and so, yeah, it's just that very musical, like here's this melody from Eastern Europe that was happening 100 years ago, and then it got passed on, and they keep coming around again. It's so humbling, but also it gives you this sense of like, well, if I can identify this, what can we do? How can we try to attack this differently? What is the possibility for redemption or change here?
Yeah, it seems another way Alex contends with some of this stuff is those amazing compositions. What's up with those? Because those are also really fun. Also, there's, I mean,
So as you know, he grew up playing music. He loves music, and I should clarify too. Like, even though he grows up listening to classical music, he's just like a fan of everything from David Bowie to he's like really into 90s hip hop and like anything that's telling a story or anything that's trying to give shape to an experience. Like he's a fan of that. And he really can't play anymore because of his hearing loss. But as he like rides his bike around or he works at a rehab facility as like a janitor, he's always like imagining these like more and more ridiculous musical compositions. A lot of them are in the spirit of like John Cage.
They're like a real Fluxus sort of like music piece kind of thing.
That's right. So like the first one, like at the beginning of the book is like all different kinds of silence, So it's like the silence of an argument that's not happening, or the silence of a cannon that doesn't fire, all these different silences. And then he thinks like, oh, wouldn't it be great to like make a musical composition that traces the history of everything since the Big Bang? Like, what would that sound like? Or then he's like, well, what would be a great musical composition where all instruments were just birds, just different kinds of birds? And that would be great. And so like, he's just always trying to think of like, what are these different compositions that can capture what it feels like to be alive at this moment, but in a way outside of, what we kind of understand as popular music. How do you use music as a space to give shape to what you're feeling, but also look at what you're going through in a different way, give you that kind of distance. And I've been really lucky. So as part of the release of the book, we asked 5 different composers, musicians, amazing performers to generate original pieces for the book. Everything from like indie rock to there's a classical music piece, a piece from this great New York musical theater composer. So there's like 5 very, very different kinds of music that try to capture some of the musical elements in the book.
Yeah, I just saw those today, actually. Maybe we should open this up to any questions.
Sure. First, let me thank Coe again for his amazing questions. You give him a round of applause for. Sometimes, Coe, you show up and you're just like, okay, I hope this person read the book. I don't know. And you're like, I'm ready to go in case they didn't. So thank you for putting the time. I know, you're in the 6th week of your semester. And so I really, really appreciate you thinking.
It was really a pleasure. It was really, really, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's such an enjoyable, wild, funny, amazing, tragic, beautiful book. So thank you for writing it, man.
Yeah, thank you. Did anyone have a question? Stun them into silence. Sure. Oh my gosh. Thanks so much. Even if you were, it still counts. So but thank you for showing up. Oh, thank you. Oh my gosh. That's really lovely. Thanks so much. Well, and as I said earlier, like, over the course of the last 2.5 years of the pandemic, I think we've been forced to confront so much loss, from the loss of friends and family. I lost two coworkers and just a month apart from each other at the early stages of the pandemic. And I still go down in the office and expect to see them, and from stores to restaurants, and I'm sure Milwaukee, there was like your favorite little noodle shop and it's gone, or and what's really interesting is there's so many things that I've loved or thought I loved that I just took for granted and didn't recognize until really the loss of the last 2.5 years, whether it's a record store, or restaurant, or bookstore, or just like the strange collision of going to a bookstore in a different city and meeting some people, like the removal of that and not having the opportunity to like come and talk to people or like go to a party. And so much of the like beauty, the music of just being a grown-up in the world comes from accidentally bumping into a stranger, and those amazing collaborations or collisions that come from that. So thank you so much for saying that. I feel exactly, genuinely like the same way. It's such a privilege to be able to talk about your work and to share it again with people. There's nothing wrong with Zoom events and existing in that plane, but there is something altogether different about being able to be in a space together.
I just wanted to say that I think the superpower of many European families is that they deal with tragedy, misfortune, and persecution and thrive on it.
Exactly. Well, so it's exactly true, because there's an expectation in the States, at least, for happiness, right? Like my kids, I love them. They're amazing people, but they generally expect things to go right. Like they expect things like when you walk downstairs, there's food in the refrigerator and and like their expectation is high, and their threshold for just being uncomfortable is really low. Whereas like growing up in my family, it was the complete opposite, and like you were raised to expect things not to go right. And you were raised to believe like 90% of adult life was just uncomfortable. And that's why I think of my grandfather, of that thing of like stepping into that room as like, oh, that's the adult condition of like, I got to talk to someone I don't want to talk to right now. And like, he's smoking, playing this strange music. And that like, that's such a gift. And it really wasn't until the pandemic that I think a lot of us as Americans, certainly my children, were really forced to reconcile themselves. That, oh, wait, not everything works out, or I'm uncomfortable and I'm still uncomfortable and I'm going to be uncomfortable for a while. And that really is, I'll say one more thing. Like my mom, she, there's people who are like amazing painters, or like amazing filmmakers, amazing cello players. My mom she collects the saddest stories and then she tells them at the least appropriate time. Like at like my kid's 1-year-old birthday, and everyone's like having cake, and she's like, and then the whole family died. And you're like, this is like a birthday party. What are you? And I remember when I started dating my wife, like, and I introduced her to my mom, and she was like, what? And like my girlfriend's like, what's your mom? What's going on? What's her deal? She's like, she really like talks about really, really sad things. And I was like, no. I was like, that's how she participates. Like, that's how she lets you know, like, that she's enjoying herself. Like, she gives you the best, saddest story. Like, that's how she like, yes. She's like, and then there's this, and then there's this. And it took her a while to recognize that like she felt most comfortable, like her way of expressing joy was through relaying these things. It's almost like knocking on wood, you know, where you're like, if I name this thing, maybe this moment will end like that. And I really do think that is such a gift. I think it's much better to expect things to, like, you know, I'm like, maybe one person will show up tonight. Great. Like that's one person, boom, you know, like, and just to have the lowest expectations, like, and then you're always surprised, you know, everything then feels like kind of a joy after that, I think.
And I wasn't.
That's right. Right. Why are you asking me this? No one ever asked me that before. Right? That's amazing. That's great. You had your hand up. That's a meta question there. Any of those. I'm happy to try to answer any of those. That's a great question. Thank you. And thanks for asking what kind of questions. No, well, so I've been a teacher for the last 23 years. I started when I was in graduate school. I was really lucky. There was a graduate training program where I could take classes and also teach classes. And I'll be totally honest, Coe, you're a teacher as well. Like I thought you could either be like a really good teacher or a really good writer. And the idea of like committing yourself to both of those seemed just ridiculous because I saw how much work it took to do both. And I just thought it was impossible to try and square both of those two different things. And at some point, I think after I'd been teaching for a couple of years, I realized like it was really just the same pursuit, just in different forms. And like everything I do as a teacher comes from what I'm interested in as a writer and really a reader. You know, like I'm 48 years old and I'm still interested in this strange magic that occurs when you take these little black shapes, put them on the page and make words and sentences, and how suddenly this conjures up characters and feelings and environment and memory. I'm really interested. It does seem, it's still after all this time seems like magic that you can do that thing. And then it's like, well, if you find that enjoyable, well, what are all the different pursuits or avenues that might lead to? And I will say, after the pandemic and being able to return to in-person classes, like similar to, you know, we were talking about earlier, like it feels like such a privilege to be in a space with people who are like struggling to tell their story, struggling to get down their own experiences, struggling to just make sense of the world. And I feel like the students I'm working with now coming out of the pandemic, like they are highly motivated. They're like, I have a reason to be doing this. This is important to me. They've been through some stuff. I recognize like I was never 20 in the middle of a pandemic, like forced to go back to my parents' house and like not have sex for 3 years or whatever. Like I mean, truly like to have their whole life just frozen. And yeah, so it feels like this great explosion of creativity and action. My students are way more engaged with social justice and activism than students from 10 years ago. And so I feel like, oh my gosh, what a privilege to be able to talk about writing, talk about reading. I come home from class with like 100 ideas, and really they just humble me. I'm like, oh my gosh, if I had half of their energy or motivation or their willingness to just like discard. Coe and I were talking earlier, like, you know, he teaches this really interesting connection between narrative and design. And like, I see those things as these totally separate things. A lot of my students, they don't see the difference between a video game and a novel and a movie and a piece of music. It's all just storytelling, and they're borrowing from all these different things. And that feels really, really exciting to me. Oh, thank you. Thanks for that question. So I'm really fortunate. My kids get up, we get them out the door, drop them off at school, and like by about 8 o'clock, the house is quiet and it's like me. And I do this weird thing. I don't know if I've ever said this before, but like I kind of like walk through the house once. I guess I don't know why, just to make sure I'm alone. Or there's like toothpaste, you gotta clean that up, or just like walk through and make sure. And then I have a little office in my house, and I just start working. And because of my children, like before they were born, I felt like time worked in this radically different way. Like I was always looking for things to do. Be like, oh, I'll meet you at 10 o'clock at night or whatever. Like I would do those things, and like just there was time. And then once our son, my second kid, showed up, now there is no time. Like, so I feel like I could fall down on the floor, and when I get back up, it's like 5 days later, and you're just like, there's just no time. And so I'm really precious with it now. So I work pretty much 5-6 days a week from 8 till about 11. And I do this thing where as I'm getting a little older now, like I have to get up after about 45 minutes, and then I walk around the house again. I like move like a thing in my daughter's room, just like move that there. And then like, I don't know what I'm doing. It's almost like visiting a museum. Do you know what I mean? It's like the most ordinary museum. There's like a pencil on my daughter's desk, and I just like move that. And I walk around for like 5 minutes, and then I go and write some more. And 99% of what I write is just really mediocre. And I'm not joking. Like it's just stuff thrown down on the page. And then the next day or later, you come back to it and you're like, okay, this has to go, this stays. And then you come back to it. And it is really not mysterious. It is not magical. It is not glamorous. It's just really like, here's this thing that's a mess, and it gets a little better and a little clearer. I don't know where I'm going. And it's just totally trial and error. But I've gotten to the point where I find that really enjoyable. Like I like the feeling that gives me of like just getting lost. I don't have that in other parts of my life. Like this weird thing happens in September when like my kids go back to school, my wife, and we're all working, and like this, like there'll be like 86 things on that little Google calendar. Like, you know what I mean? If you have one of those like Apple Google calendars, and it'll be like there'll be like 85 of them, and it'll tell me exactly where I need to be for the next 3 months. And like part of your heart just dies, and you like have to click off on all of those. And so like that thing, when I sit down to work, like I don't want to know where the characters are going to go or what they're going to do. Or like, to me, that's the joy of like reading fiction. And so like to write it, like I have to kind of be open to just getting lost and try and figure it out and making some discoveries as it's happening. And so I like it, but it's just not a efficient process. So for like this book's 300 pages, there's probably 150, 200 pages that just doesn't make the book. It's part of the book, it's part of the process, but they're real bad, and you just know, I mean, they are, and you have to just be like, okay, that's just what it is. I'm like cutting away to get to the most interesting stuff here. And that takes so much of the pressure off, because then you don't have to be good from the beginning. You don't even have to be good for most of the time, and so you're like, I'm just doing this thing, and eventually it'll get better. And you just have to kind of trust in that. Okay. Thank you so much, Milwaukee. Incredible. Thanks
you,
to
Joe.
Daniel and Chris at Boswell. And thanks so much to Coe as
Yeah.
well.
Thank you, Joe.